Boa tarde. Boa tarde a todos. I'll switch to English. On behalf of the Dean of the Institute for Political Studies, João Carlos Espada, I welcome you to our session, which is the Adolfo Suarez Memorial Debate. I will hand it over to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Spain in Portugal, Doña Marta Betanzos Roig. Welcome, Madam Ambassador.
Boa tarde a todos. Senhor Deán, muito obrigada pelo convite. É a segunda vez, acho que estou aqui a partilhar experiencias en Lisboa, Cascais, Estoril, perdón. Portanto, sento-me muito grata e espero, desejo que seja esta uma boa oportunidade de retornar a nossas conversas. Vejo na pantalla, no screen, os colegas de Madrid. Benvindos a todos. E, dado que não temos muito tempo, vou simplesmente fazer um intento de enquadramento, de explicar quais são os temas, as cuestiones que básicamente pueden ocupar las intervenciones dos expertos esta tarde. De qué manera la península ibérica, Portugal y España van a confrontar, a reaccionar al COVID y a la recuperación, y cuál es su visión también en esta recuperación de su condición de países ibéricos. Voy a hablar en español, podría hacerlo en inglés, pero creo que nos expresamos mejor en nuestro idioma. Por otra parte, cualquier pregunta la podré responder en cualquier otro idioma. Básicamente, España y Portugal, como países europeos, hemos tenido la enorme fortuna de vernos apoyados por la reacción de los Estados miembros, en particular de la Comisión, para poder hacer frente a la recuperación con dos instrumentos financieros que son básicos, los fondos de recuperación denominados EU Next Generation Funds, con los cuales vamos a recibir a lo largo de los próximos 3 años una cantidad importante de dinero que no es gratis, que tendremos que devolver y que se podrá emplear en invertir en sectores cruciales de nuestra economía, y no solamente en sectores cruciales para recuperar nuestro tejido industrial y productivo, sino también para mejorar la capacitación, los recursos humanos y llevar a cabo una necesaria transición hacia una economía verde, una economía que no contamine, que sea sustentable, y también hacia una economía en donde el elemento digital, la incorporación de las nuevas tecnologías, mejoren también nuestra competitividad y nos permitan llegar más lejos. Estos fondos de recuperación tienen también una intención que va más allá de la recuperación económica, también tienen una proyección social y persiguen que nadie quede excluido en esta fase de recuperación, que no acontezca lo que ocurrió en otras crisis previas en las que hubo, además de un empobrecimiento social, un incremento de grupos sociales, familias, personas que quedaron desplazadas y no pudieron coger la marcha del tren de la recuperación. Y, por tanto, en este momento se pretende que sea una recuperación también inclusiva y transversal, en la cual todos los elementos de la sociedad, también el elemento género, queden recogidos. Bien, con estos fondos de recuperación se espera que lleguemos a convertir, a transformar nuestras economías en economías verdes, digitales, en donde la movilidad sea una movilidad inteligente y al mismo tiempo mejoremos no solamente la competitividad, sino también un elemento nuevo que se ha puesto de manifiesto precisamente como consecuencia del COVID, que nos permita también mejorar nuestra autonomía estratégica. Hablando por autonomía estratégica, no solamente la meramente defensiva en términos de seguridad, sino autonomía estratégica también en torno a la necesidad de dotarnos de medios suficientes que permitan que nuestro sistema económico funcione sin extremadas o peligrosas dependencias de otros mercados u otros contextos geopolíticos. Lo hemos visto recientemente cuando surgió la necesidad de encontrar recursos sanitarios para hacer frente al COVID y fue extremadamente difícil. Hemos visto que esa autonomía ha mejorado bien o ha mejorado sustancialmente cuando Europa ha sabido constituir un pool entre todos los Estados miembros para acceder a las vacunas, y es lo que permite que hoy en día podamos estar aquí, entre otras cosas, así como recuperar nuestra actividad económica, viajes, turismos, movilidad, etcétera. Y esa autonomía es la que esperamos que sea también necesaria para que nuestro sistema productivo no supere, por ejemplo, la crisis que estamos ahora padeciendo, no solamente energética también, sino también en cuanto a componentes importantes para que no funcionen, digamos, nuestras empresas e industrias. Me refiero a los microchips, etcétera, y a componentes de otra característica. Con esta autonomía estratégica, de las que nos podremos dotar o funcionar a través de los fondos de recuperación, esperamos que las inversiones nos permitan romper estas cadenas de dependencia. Para ello, estos planes también prevén que no se funcione solamente con inversiones de carácter público, sean inversiones y mejoras producto de una asociación entre el sector público y el sector privado. Eso es una experiencia que esperamos que también sea positiva y que genere dinamismo en nuestros mecanismos decisorios. Y, por último, hay un elemento, para no agotar todos los componentes del debate, hay un elemento que no solamente ibérico en sentido estricto de la palabra, sino que es también internacional y de dimensión atlántica. Y ahí es donde el componente iberoamericano tiene todo su gran protagonismo. Hablar de Iberoamérica es siempre muy sugerente porque nunca terminamos de definir el continente iberoamericano más allá de los límites geográficos o de las características geográficas. Y hoy en día nos encontramos con que, al igual que ocurre en otros ámbitos geográficos, también en Iberoamérica hay ciclos nuevos, hay un ciclo electoral nuevo, hay ciertas crisis de gobernanza que no solamente ocurren en este continente o en este ámbito regional, y también hay elementos disruptivos como es la entrada de elementos de comunicación a través de las redes sociales, el fenómeno del populismo, que también lo hemos visto en Europa, y también un proceso de empobrecimiento de ciertas clases sociales que está siendo crecientemente acusado. Frente a ello, lo que se está volviendo a reivindicar es de nuevo un retorno, un reforzamiento al multilateralismo, al reforzamiento de las organizaciones regionales, la Comunidad Iberoamericana, la Organización de Estados Iberoamericanos en el ámbito cultural, la OEA, y qué es lo que se le pide a la península ibérica, a los países ibéricos y también a través de ellos a Europa, pues una mayor implicación, un mayor compromiso de Europa con Iberoamérica. Es un compromiso que tanto Portugal como España asumimos plenamente, lideramos también con el máximo de compromiso y buscamos, entre otras cosas, dar señales, signos de ambición, pero sobre todo de no contentarnos con lo que hasta ahora se haya alcanzado, se haya logrado, que no es mucho, sino procurar movilizar a todos nuestros países amigos del ámbito europeo para que tanto los acuerdos de libre comercio como la renovación o el impulso al Mercosur sea en breve una realidad. Y con esto yo creo que ya he agotado mi capacidad de reclamar su atención, y creo que es la oportunidad ya de que tomen la palabra los que realmente son expertos en estas materias. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, señora embajadora. I will now give the floor to our colleague, Professor Charles Powell, who will address some words to the audience. Professor Powell is the director of the Real Instituto Elcano de Madrid and also professor in contemporary history at the CEU San Pablo University in Madrid. Welcome, Professor Powell. I hope the sound is okay. And the floor, actually the virtual floor, is yours.
Thank you so much, José Miguel. Boa tarde, muito obrigado. And let me first of all thank Professor Spada and the hosts of this wonderful 29th edition of the Estoril Political Forum. I am devastated not to be able to be with you in person in the wonderful Hotel Palacio. It would have been lovely to see you all in the flesh. I am very much with you in spirit, and it's wonderful to see our brilliant Spanish ambassador, Marta Betanzos, looking remarkably elegant, by the way, if I may say so. So let me just say a few things, José Miguel, about the way we had planned this seminar initially. Last year, you will remember, we basically talked about the impact of the pandemic. And this year, we decided rather optimistically to talk about how we are preparing for a post-pandemic world. And I say that we have to be a little bit more cautious, perhaps, than we were when we first formulated this title, because let me remind you, about 5 million people have died worldwide as a result of the pandemic. This is the official figure as of early October. The real figure is probably much higher, sadly. In Spain alone, the official figure is 87,000 victims. Again, sadly, the real figure is probably higher. And in addition to that, we are still in the midst of a very severe economic downturn, which is a worldwide phenomenon. And let me just remind you, according to the latest official figures, 225 million people worldwide have lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. And in the OECD countries alone, Spain and Portugal included, of course, a total of about 22 million people have lost their jobs. So although we very much want to believe that we're moving towards a post-pandemic scenario, let us keep in mind those who are still suffering, the countries which are still in a very real danger of being left behind. And I'm afraid this may include a significant number of Latin American countries, obviously African countries and countries elsewhere. And let me also introduce a slightly critical note or pessimistic note with regard to the way in which our multilateral international order has responded to these challenges. Frankly, the performance of organizations such as the G8 and the G20 has been underwhelming, I think, to say the very least. One asks oneself, to be honest, what does it take? What will it take for the international community to take these global challenges more seriously than we have so far? And again, to be honest, the way in which the vaccine rollout is being administered worldwide leaves a great deal to be desired. Sadly, we can now certainly predict that the world will be a more unequal place in years to come as a result of the pandemic. There will be greater inequality between the more advanced economies and the less advanced countries. And of course, we also know, and this is visible in our own societies, even in our own more developed societies, there will be more marked differences and greater inequality within our societies as well. Is there a silver lining in this COVID-19 cloud? Well, Ambassador Betanzos, I think, pointed to one of the few silver linings that I can find, at least in a European Union context, and that is the fact that we have woken up to the need for greater European strategic autonomy. As she said, very rightly, this is no longer a concept that we are applying to the defense and security realm. We are also applying it now even more urgently, I think, to matters of technological and scientific autonomy. And this, I think, may ultimately be one of the most positive legacies of the crisis. By the way, I prefer the term strategic responsibility to the term strategic autonomy, because strategic autonomy suggests that we are doing things without others, without other partners outside the EU. I prefer to think of the things that we as Europeans want to do by ourselves without having to ask anyone else for permission, and of course, without having to borrow the capabilities, military or civilian capabilities necessary to do those things. Having said that, well, we are all placing our hopes, very much placing our hopes in the hands of the European Union. It's true that the Iberian Peninsula, I think, has been spectacularly successful in terms of the vaccine rollout. In Spain, about 80% of the population is now fully vaccinated. And I understand in Portugal, the figure is now close to 86%. And I was very struck recently by a headline in the New York Times on the 1st of October, which rather amusingly said, in Portugal, there is virtually no one left to vaccinate. So well done, Portugal. Sadly, of course, as you know, other EU member states are not doing so impressively. And of course, as we will see in a minute, many countries in Latin America are still very far from having achieved these levels of success. Let me just conclude. There is something else that concerns me and concerns us at Elcano, and that is that we seem to be putting virtually all of our hopes in something else the ambassador mentioned, namely the EU recovery and resilience plans, the Next Generation EU program. In the Spanish case, this effectively means 70,000 euros, 70 billion euros in grants and another potential 70 billion euros in loans. By the way, Spain isn't talking about borrowing money yet, which I'm sure Javier Fernandez Vaschetti strongly approves of. We don't want to borrow more money. The Italian government, interestingly, is already contemplating this. So this is perhaps something that we should look at. But to me, and I'll conclude with this, the real question is whether these funds are really going to produce the systemic structural transformation of the Spanish economy. Obviously, this will be a greener and more digital economy in 3 years' time, but the challenge of spending such vast amounts of money in a relatively short period of time is unprecedented. And there is a serious issue, I think, with regards to what experts describe as the country's absorption capacity. Now, a great deal will depend on the ability to get Spain's very sophisticated, if not complex, multi-level governance system to work well. So Javier in his office in Madrid, as you can see, that's the Spanish regional flag, the Madrid regional flag behind him. And so that photograph, that shot of Javier's office personifies exactly what I'm talking about. We need the regional, the national, and the European level of governance to work seamlessly. And I very much hope that this will be the case, but the jury is still out there to some extent. So we are facing this enormous challenge. Portugal is as well. But my final point would be, let us not fall into the trap of navel gazing, of looking inwards at our own problems, and forget about the problems facing the Latin American republics, our brothers and sisters overseas across the Atlantic, who still look to us in Europe for support, for solidarity, and perhaps even for a bit of humane and decent behavior at the global multilateral level. So I will keep my fingers crossed, and hopefully when we meet in the flesh, when we meet in person in Estoril next year, many of the issues that the ambassador and I have raised will have been successfully resolved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Charles Powell, for joining us from Madrid. And we will now proceed to the second part of this session. After the opening words of Madam Ambassador and the intervention of the director of the Elcano Institute, we will give the floor to the four speakers, the four experts, who will present their statements in 10 minutes each. And I would respectfully ask for all of us to contain in our time. And the first one will be our colleague, Professor Ángel Gifero, who is a professor at the Department of Politics and International Relations of the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, where he teaches political theory. Thank you very much. Welcome to the Estoril Political Forum. The floor is yours.
Muito obrigado. Agradeço imenso ao professor Espada e ao Instituto de Estudos Políticos o convite para fazer parte deste fantástico Estoril Political Forum e também agradeço muito a vossa presença nesta tarde de verão. I'm not, as said by Professor Sardica, I'm not an expert in the future, economic future after the pandemic. I'm a teacher of political theory at the Autonomous University in Madrid. So this topic that is in this table, preparing for a post-COVID world, the view from Iberia and Latin America, I'm going to change a little bit and I will concentrate on a different but connected topic that is the COVID pandemic and the political pandemic, a personal view not from Iberia but from Spain. A pandemic is the outbreak of a disease prevalent over a whole country or the world. According to the Spanish official data, already mentioned by Professor President Speaker Charles Powell, almost 90,000 persons died of COVID-19 in Spain during these last 2 years. And, but fortunately, Portugal, Spain as equal as Portugal, have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. No? Portugal is second in the world in vaccination, and in Spain, almost 80% of the Spanish population is fully vaccinated. This high level of vaccination permitted a certain level of normalcy in the social life in Spain that is so important to us. And the idea of arriving soon to a post-COVID situation is something that is feasible and it's not yet done, but it's something we can imagine in the near future. But the foreseeable end of the pandemic, this health pandemic, is not accompanied with political optimism in Spain, perhaps contrary to what Charles Taylor said. No? As someone said, 2 pandemics are sweeping the planet. One is COVID-19, and the other is a global democratic blight causing political life to become more polarized and less democratic. We are confident that COVID-19 is going to be defeated soon, but the political pandemic is going to stay with us for a while, at least in Spain. Yesterday, there was a lot of people speaking exactly about this other pandemic, that is the political one that is named by populism, and other names are used to define this other pandemic. This session is dedicated to the memory of Adolfo Suarez, who was Prime Minister of Spain between 1976 and 1981, who with King Juan Carlos was crucial in the establishment of democracy in my country after the authoritarian rule of Francisco Franco. The Spain of today, of course, is very different from the one of Suarez. Today's Spain is a much modern, developed country, and by that time, Spain was an isolated and less developed country. Now, Spain is a modern country, and it was not so clear by that time that Spain was that. But contrary to today, Spain, in that time, in the time of Suarez, was in love with democracy, full of excitement of the joy of freedom, and aimed at a clear goal shared by all political forces, to become a part of the free world and share our destiny with our neighbors. That is, to become part of Europe, of what is called today the European Union. This predominant mood of that time was optimistic and was characterized by self-reliance. But after more than 40 years of democracy, this is not longer the case in Spain. Spain reached the goal of becoming one of the most democratic countries in the world. According to The Economist, Spain is ranked 22nd in 22nd position out of 177 countries. And from the first time that this democracy index was published, Spain belongs to the selected group of only 23 full democracies in the world. So the situation is a little bit paradoxical in the sense that the mood about the Spanish democracy is pessimistic, and on the other hand, Spain ranked very high in the quality of its democracy. Self-confidence today is so deteriorated that the very existence of a democracy in Spain is under discussion. For instance, radical parties in Spain neglect that Spain is a democracy, and they call Spain a post-fascist or Francoist state. No? This is something that can be discussed in the Spanish public opinion, and it's a strong contrast with the reality of the place that Spain occupies in the democracy index. This lot of faith in the Spanish democracy began in 2008 with the economic crisis and was followed in 2011 by a populist movement. What's interesting, this movement was not created by a party, but it was in the society, it was born in the society, so in a sense was on the side of the demand. The Spanish, for at least part of the Spanish population, demanded a populist response to the predicament of democracy. And following this demand of populist answers to the predicaments of the Spanish democracy was created the first populist party in Spain, that is Podemos, no? So this demand of populism was followed on the supply side by the creation of this party. The banners or the slogans of this populist movement or party were "Real Democracy Now," and "They do not represent us," two anti-political slogans that were also against this reality of Spain as a democracy. These anti-political demands survived the end of the economic crisis, and to me it seems that they are able to survive the COVID-19 pandemic. Thus, populism in Spain is here to stay, and this means, as was already noted yesterday, that democracy is in trouble. Also yesterday, many of the evils of the Western democracies were enumerated. For instance, I think it was Durão Barroso, he said that among these evils were political polarization that divides societies and makes impossible cooperation and even the functioning of government. Another evil was populism, already mentioned, and others were nationalism, nativism and xenophobia, cultural wars, and identity politics. Well, we have all of them in Spain. It was also mentioned yesterday that democracies need, in order to be efficient, to have a strong center. In Spain, still today, the two most important parties are a center-left party, the Socialist Party, that is now in government, and a center-right party, the Popular Party. But contrary to what would be expected, they seem to be incapable of cooperating between them. Having so much in common, for instance, the constitutional consensus, as a result of this, the constitutional consensus. As a result of this, the 7th of January 2020, a coalition government was formed in Spain. This coalition government is integrated by the Socialist Party and an electoral coalition that includes the populist party Podemos and the Communist Party. for the first time in more than 80 years, Spain have ministers that are proud to be communist. That's quite shocking for us because the last communist minister we have was at the end of the Second Republic. And well, it's interesting that one of these ministers, Alberto Garzón, wrote before becoming minister a book called Why I'm a Communist. And I wrote a review of this book that was not very kind, explaining that one cannot be a communist after the experience of communism in Europe. But the reality is that he was right and I'm wrong, because one can be communist and a minister of consumer affairs at the same time. So for the first time in more than 80 years, Spain have radicals of the government, and this shows how the political climate of the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century has changed in Spain, from the celebration of liberalism, the so-called end of history, to the resurrection of communism. For instance, the case of the Spanish Communist Party is more contrasted with Portugal. Has a very interesting history, because the Spanish Communist Party abandoned Marxist-Leninism in the 70s, so it became a sort of social democratic party, very close to the Italian Communist Party. But in the present, very recently, very few years ago, this ideology of the party was converted again in the main core ideology of the party. So now the Communist Party, again, in contrast to what happened in the 70s, is again a Leninist party. So,
Professor Rivero.
Oh, sorry.
Your time.
The effects of these circumstances are predictable. A radicalization of politics and society, a political climate of anxiety and uncertainty, and a strong erosion of democratic political institutions. I'm going to skip and going to the end. No? So, what view can Iberia, Spain offer to the post-COVID world? Well, let's try to be positive. Illness that doesn't kill makes us stronger. No? That can be said. And perhaps the resilience of the Spanish democracy can be seen as the promise of a future where democracies, by structuring new alliances of democracies, can solve all these problems we have, not only the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the political pandemic is suffering all the Western world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rivera, for your contribution. We will proceed by giving the floor to Javier Fernandez Laschetti, who joins us from Madrid. He's currently the Regional Minister of Economy, Finance and Employment in Madrid, in the team led by Isabel Díaz Ayuso. And previously, he was Regional Minister of Health in Madrid, Regional Minister of Immigration, worked as Deputy Director of José María Aznar's ministerial cabinet, and he was a member of the Spanish Parliament. Thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours. Bienvenido.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Boa tarde. Well, first, I would like to thank Professor Espada and the Institute of Political Studies for organizing this forum and for having me one more year in it. This event, I think, is a must, which gives us the opportunity to bring together such relevant people and organizations from the academic, business, political, and media world to debate and share new ideas with a critical spirit, and I think that's very, very important. And I have to admit that seeing you at that wonderful venue in Estoril makes me miss really, really very much being with you there. but what can I do? So please allow me to share with you a presentation that I will go along with my comments. I'm not allowed to share. Okay, well, without the presentation, I'm going. Well, I'd like to start by pointing out that in the current context of recovery after the severe health and economic crisis caused by the coronavirus, the markets are facing very high uncertainty about what would the new global economy will be like in a post-COVID world. A very representative example of this uncertainty can be found in the position of central banks with respect to the inflation, which has become the spectre that is once again haunting the world, threatening the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. Factors such as the recovery of global demand, the increase in the price of raw materials, especially oil, copper, and food, and bottlenecks in the global supply chain are beginning to put pressure on the general price level. Although it's still too early to know whether the risk of inflation is a long-term problem, it's certain that in many countries, the escalation of prices is having a very worrying effect on consumers' baskets of goods. No? To give some concrete figures for annual inflation as of September 2021, in Latin America, the latest data show annual inflation that has alarmingly exceeded the targets stipulated by central banks in countries such as Peru, 5.3% inflation, Colombia, 4.5%, Mexico, 6% inflation, or Brazil, 10.3% inflation so far. Meanwhile, in the United States, inflation is at 5.3%, the highest in 13 years. In Europe, inflation came in at 3.4%, back to the levels of 13 years ago. And here in Spain, inflation has now reached 4%. It's the highest level since 2008. Thus, this inflation outlook generates great uncertainty regarding the tone of monetary policy of the central banks, and the Federal Reserve in the United States and the European Central Bank to date have maintained an expansive policy of low interest rates and ambitious debt purchase programs. That policy, to quote the Nobel Prize Hayek, has fueled credit to panic, a borrowing of states which, in the face of an unexpected rise in interest rates to contain inflation, could raise the cost of debt and put in risk the solvency of many countries. This persistent attitude of central banks in the highly abnormal, in the terminology of Rubini, tone of their policies may jeopardize their own credibility, further fueling this uncertainty, which is reflected in very high volatility of the financial markets. We must therefore remain very vigilant in the face of the pressure that governments are putting on central banks, as their ambitious spending programs are weakening the growth of the world economy. On the other hand, with respect to the real economy, the great black swan of the COVID-19 pandemic has further revived the anti-globalization agenda, with governments demanding greater protectionism and interventionism under the pretext of reinforcing citizen security in the face of any new threat. However, what the anti-globalization movements have not yet been able to understand is that it is precisely the measures adopted by all governments after the outbreak of the pandemic that constitute the best experiment for their demands. The Swedish writer Johan Norberg has said, and I quote, "We have just seen a real-life preview of a deglobalized, closed world We have no travel, no mobility, no trade, no offshoring, no capitalist exploitation. We have shut down the world for just 2 months, and the result is already in global depression, mass unemployment, poverty, and hunger. So it's a preview of a horror movie. I end the quote. But I think Norberg thus points out the important lesson. Liberal democracy is only compatible with an open market economy, and therefore any attack on globalization represents an attack on liberal democracy and its values. And it's therefore very necessary to explain the enormous benefits that open trade and free mobility of goods, capital, and people have brought us. And in his book, The Great Escape, Nobel Prize winning economist Angus Deaton explains how between 1970 and 2006, poverty in the world fell from 40% to 14% of the world's population. These data have subsequently been confirmed by the World Bank, which estimates an extreme poverty rate of 9.1% of the world population in 2020, despite the terrible COVID crisis. In fact, discounting the effect of the pandemic, the global extreme poverty would be 7.9%. This achievement has not been done with tariffs, cross-border controls on free movement, or any other form of protectionism. It has been done through the greatest trade opening in human history in a context of increasingly connected markets that has allowed countries to specialize in what they do best and to offer consumers cheaper goods and services. Because globalization is not a zero-sum game. The contrary, it's a win-win, and therefore we need to continue on this path. Some governments, far from understanding the dynamics of the free market, insist on slowing it down or annihilating it through the regulation and fiscal policies. We can see very relevant examples of this new type of interventionism on a global scale, such as the regulation of money laundering prevention, which seeks to establish a scrutiny of investments that is completely normal, but it's actually creating barriers to entry to new capital in developing countries. But in my opinion, there is one case that I consider very important to highlight, as it's generating great controversy in the international level. And I'm referring to the setting of a global minimum corporate tax rate. This initiative, which has been promoted mainly by the G7 governments, represents the fundamental pillar of the so-called tax harmonization, which aims to ensure that all companies pay a minimum corporate tax regardless of the country where they operate. The reason that governments gives for a global minimum rate for this tax is based on the need to put an end to the tax competition that leads to different countries around the world to reduce the tax rate in order to attract international companies. And I have to say that this globalized taxation are very detrimental to countries, especially emerging countries in Latin America, which currently have corporate tax rates below 15%. I'm not talking about tax havens. I'm talking about countries, normal countries, which have corporate tax rates below 15%. This is because any tax increase is ultimately borne by individuals. Some tend to think of companies as empty buildings capable of paying taxes, but the reality is that they are made up of people who either as workers through lower wages or as consumers through higher prices will suffer from the rise in corporate tax that represents the global minimum rate. The University of Oxford, which is a pioneer in tax studies, has conducted a number of studies which shows that in the short term, increasing corporation tax by £1 tends to reduce wages by around 50 pence. In other words, at least 50% of the increase in corporate tax is borne entirely by workers. And I think we should have thus that in mind when we speak about about Latin America. I think we should better defend tax competition, giving freedom to those states that, in an intelligent and respectful manner with citizens, set tax rates at lower level to attract capital and the best talent, as we do in the past. For instance, clearly Spain and Portugal. Of course, it's essential to take into account all the necessary criteria that in a post-COVID world guarantee the security of citizens, as well as that tax system adapt to new economic reality. Here we have a lot of work to do to review and perfect a regulation that is as transparent, as simple as possible, while respecting freedom at all times. Conclusion, I have tried in this forum to identify the main risks we face in the immediate future in a economic scenario of greater state interventionism at the global level, and for which we need to stand firm, in my opinion, in the defense of freedom as the basic pillar of the economic growth that globalization has brought us in recent decades. Thank you once again, Professor Espada and the forum team. And I would like to end encouraging all attendees to continue working in defense of individual liberty and the free market economy as the best way to achieve development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for your thoughtful ideas. And we shall proceed with our third speaker of this afternoon, Professor Carlos Malamud, also joining us through Zoom. He's a senior analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute and also a professor of American history at the National University of Distance Education, the UNED. And he has been ranked in the past as one of the 50 most influential Ibero-American intellectuals. Thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours for your 10-minute statement.
Muito obrigado, boa tarde. It's a pleasure to be a year more here in this Adolfo Suarez Memorial Debate. I wish that the next year in Estoril we will have plenty personal debate. But let me start speaking about Latin American reality. In fact, Latin America is the region of the world was most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The continent only has the 8% of the world population, but has suffered more than 25% of deaths caused by the virus. This number shows the structural weakness of the public health systems of the different Latin American countries. In the pre-pandemic years, there was in Latin America a strong and growing sense of disaffection with democracy, a lack of trust in political institutions such as parties, parliaments, and judiciary, and also a very strong anti-elitist feeling. The widespread of social mobilizations on the last months of 2019, sometimes with a violent bias, are a good evidence of the persistence of this social unrest, as the cases of Chile, Colombia, and Ecuador, among others, show. The pandemic has had devastating effects on the region and has aggravated all existing problems, such as health, social, economic, and political ones. Practically all the public health systems have collapsed, and except for a few successful cases, Uruguay and Ecuador, the vaccination process are not well developed, and Venezuela and Nicaragua are two of the more problematic cases. Socially speaking, there is more unemployment, more malnutrition, more hunger, more school dropout, more inequality, and more informal work, all of which is reflected in increased poverty and extreme poverty all across the region. Economically, there is a greater national diversity, but with few exceptions, growth has slowed considerably, and it is difficult to recover pre-crisis income levels this year, and in some cases, in some countries, also not in 2022. The increase of the national debt to manage the high cost of dealing with the pandemic has made Latin American countries more vulnerable to external markets and also to external shocks. Finally, from a political point of view, we have seen all across the continent a strengthening of the role of the state. In this area, however, what is most worrying is the rise of authoritarianism and certain populist governments, both on the left and on the right. All of this process triggered major setbacks for democracy. On top of this, the structural weakness of governments make the impact of democracies even more serious. In this way, we see, as I have said previously, the emergence of messianic populist leaders, both on the right and on the left of the political spectrum. On the one hand, for example, we have Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and on the other, the Mexican president Andrés Manuel López Obrador, well known as AMLO. But we have more examples like Nayib Bukele in El Salvador and in Nicaragua, the Ortega Murillo couple, the neo-Somocist regime in Central America. All of them encourage ideological polarization and the breakdown of relations between the power of the state by attempting to subordinate the legislative and judicial branches to the executive. This is a very serious step backwards that fractures society. And it's precisely here that social media contribute little or nothing to the consolidation of democracy. With fake news and under cover of anonymity, the social media are changing the meaning of political debate, preventing those who think differently from engaging in dialogue and making progress in the construction of more socially cohesive societies. Instead, they are creating division based on a hate and xenophobic speech, in many cases add with an anti-immigration bias and load with high levels of violence. Violence, organized crime, drug trafficking, in short, citizen insecurity, all together with corruption, have become the main problems of dissatisfied societies. It should not be forgotten that since 2014, serious problems have begun for those social sectors that had joined the middle classes and suddenly are beginning to see that their expectations and demands are no longer being met and that the possibility of their children consolidating the steps they have taken is being frustrated. The problems generated by the pandemic have been multiplied by the lack of regional integration. In this long year and a half since the beginning of the pandemic, it has been impossible to coordinate policies among governments to minimize the effect of the virus. Vaccination has not been the only case, but perhaps one of the most damaging. It has been impossible for regional governments to negotiate jointly with the laboratories and countries producing the vaccines to obtain better results and supply a greater number of doses to apply to this population. And although the Pan American Health Organization is much older than the World Health Organization, it has not been possible to develop common practices in Latin America for conducting experiments in the various countries of the region or to approve vaccines that could be inoculated in the population. The failure of the late CELAC summit, the late is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, is the best evidence of this situation and the best evidence of the frustration of the evolution of the integration process, of the regional integration process in Latin America. From here, the big question is what to do to be much more effective in the subsequent post-COVID reconstruction process. However, the answer must take into account that the region, like the rest of the world, is immersed in the planetary Greek game that confronts China with the United States. It is precisely the lack of integration that prevents a policy similar to the European Union strategic neutrality from having any success. Each Latin American country will have to fight on its own, and this puts them in a weaker position to solve this dilemma. There are 2 points where the convergence with the EU, and to some extent also with the US, will be useful. On the one hand, the Green Pact, everything associated with the fight against climate change and the transformation of the energy matrix based on the strong commitment to the development of renewable energies. On the other hand, the link with the digital revolution, the digital transformation. But for this to make sense and for society as a whole to represent it in the project, a broad commitment is needed from the elites, from all of them, from the political elites, the economic elites, the social elites, and the cultural ones, but also from the old elites and the new elites. In this reconstruction process, all the elites is necessary. This implies the need for new social contracts to come into force in the different countries. Without them, the institutional crisis will continue to advance, along with the unstoppable progression of illiberal democracies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Carlos Malamud. And it is a bit awkward that the chair is also one of the speakers. I shall not present myself, it's in the leaflet. And after insightful portraits of Spain, the Iberian space, and Latin America, let me add a short reflection on Portugal as a playing part of post-COVID world. This is exactly what I had agreed in advance with Professor Charles Powell when invited to this panel within my given minutes. In the beginning of 2020, reasons for optimism seemed to abound in Portugal. GDP had registered its 25th quarter of continuous growth, 2.6 in the last quarter of 2019. Unemployment was at the lowest record since the start of the decade. Public debt was diminishing, and for the first time in more than 4 decades, the country had attained a positive balanced budget. Socialist governmental discourse paraded these and other numbers as a Portuguese miracle, in one of those leap-forward spasms of patriotism that so regularly have accompanied national history. All things changed dramatically from March 2020 onwards, when COVID-19 hit hard around the globe, forcing countries into lockdowns and economic social downturns. In the last 19 months, Portugal entered the same merry-go-round of others with the pandemic numbers. Health-wise, the first wave was not very deadly compared to other countries in Europe or elsewhere. However, in the winter of 2021, miraculous Portugal turned into a medical, humanitarian, economic, educational, and social disaster. Hospital admissions and COVID deaths soared, reaching more than 15,000 infected and more than 300 casualties per day. A second general lockdown came for weeks, and Portugal, alongside Spain, faced the largest economic contraction in the EU, while putting up one of the smallest budget aids to crisis victims. Less than 5% of GDP against 15%, for instance, in Germany or the United States. 2020 saw a sharp downfall of 7.6% in GDP, while public debt GDP ratio jumped 138%, the third worst in Europe after Greece and Italy. Unemployment, wage reductions, and poverty also worsened, though real numbers have been masked by the ticking bomb of corporate layoffs and credit moratoria. Tourism, The number one industry from which Portugal is indeed over-dependent receded to 2008 levels, inflicting a cascade of negative effects on so many businesses and families. Yes, it is true that the Portuguese were not alone in the global economic contraction and human sufferance. What I would like to emphasize is how, because of pre-existing structural reasons and in light of noticeable features of our post-COVID options, Portugal risks missing the upsurge bounce effect that other countries are already surfing, reopening their economies, sponsoring social recovery, and having a go in the coming years. Let me try to reason this by stating how much the near past can indeed be a blocker for the near future. Portugal changed variously in the last decades, especially since its EEC entrance in 1986, transitioning from a poor, agriculturally based and feeble, knowledgeable country into a modern, urban, literate nation, closing some gap towards the EU average standards. But as many still point out critically, structural blockages persisted, and the current national pandemic crisis was harder than elsewhere precisely because of them. An underskilled and poorly paid workforce, a low productivity economy, the strictness of labor legislation, a bureaucratic and sometimes over-regulatory state, a very high tax burden, social inequality and profound imbalances, divorcing the urban coastal Portugal from an abandoned and aged interior, produced since the dawn of the century residual annual growth rates of around 0.5%, while GDP per capita has been 20 to 30% lower than the EU average since 2000. The overweight of the state on economy, society, families, private businesses, and entrepreneurship is a national feature, determining a continuous public indebtedness and a weakening and impoverishment of the civic fabric. Party politics tend to rule governmental policies, and through ill-suited ideological options or lack of resources, the state intervenes too much where it should stand down and is unable to fulfill adequately those tasks where a smaller and operational state should act. The reaction to the health crisis showed how public and private actions must combine to foster solutions and relief. The National Health Service was tested to its limits and was able to match immediate demand, vaccinations numbers showing it despite the array of medical care not provided to diseases other than COVID. More important, there was a gigantic civic mobilization from all sides of society. If such a collective and social answering pattern should prevail in normal times, perhaps Portugal would be better off. This goes to show that the Portuguese are as able to go the extra mile in abnormal times as they seem to be sort of sleepy outside critical moments. Signs of hope could then lift our spirits. However, many of the signs aligning seems to force us to be shrewd, realistic, and perhaps even pessimistic about the Portuguese near future. Approved in February 2021, the PRR, Portuguese acronym for Recovery and Resilience Plan, will pour into the country until 2026 around 16.6 thousand million euros out of the 750,000 million approved by the EU. Prime Minister and pundits have been calling it a financial bazooka to foster a more sustainable, inclusive, digitalized, efficient, and green country. The PRR has thus gained in public debate or electoral propaganda a sort of godlike status, a miraculous gift that will solve every problem. Herein may reside precisely the biggest question conditioning our Portuguese post-COVID scenario. According to the Eurostat, even before the PRR, Portugal was already the EU member with the largest dependency rate on European funds, around 80%. With the general election coming in 2 years, I am afraid that the government will have the temptation of governmentalizing the Portuguese recovery plan in a Keynesian public spending model, instead of allocating funds to whom and where they are called for to unleash the productive potential of the country. Many analysts are warning against the risk of just pouring money into bad options without energizing a much-needed private sector and some key public policies with a real positive impact. That is, boosting productivity, competitiveness, and exports, and creating wealth to reduce poverty, foster social and territorial cohesion, help families, businesses, ideas, and people to strive after such a dire strait. Simply put, if captured by political spending, the Portuguese bazooka risks being yet another misused opportunity, unable to change the overall stagnant path registered in the last 20 years. And I'll conclude by stating that in the post-COVID, hopefully brave new world, departing from the saddened, grave new world of these last 19 months, Portugal must collectively be watchful of its government and its ruling elites. The country needs civic awareness and action to define new political goals, social bonds, working habits, a growing economy, a science meets tech and culture environment, all this attainable through structural reforms in the state apparatus, in the fiscal policies, in the judicial system, and so on. The PRR as an instrument and the government must be a means to an end and not the end in itself. Furthermore, Portugal should turn outwards for a better place in the world, using its historical Latin Atlantic identity and outreach as a soft power to cooperate with other continents and to work with Spain to turn the Iberian Peninsula into an important geographical counterpart to the post-Brexit European Easternization tendency. Embedded in a VUCA, the acronym for Volatile, Uncertain, Complex, and Ambiguous World Context, check the current energetic crisis already looming in the country, the post-pandemic moment will certainly be very testing for such a small, problem-riddled, but historically surviving nation like Portugal, whether the country will meet the tests and be able to close the gap towards the EU average, only time will tell. Thank you very much for your attention. We are running a little bit late, but still a couple of minutes before the closure of the panel, and so I would give the floor to one or two questions that the audience wants to pop up, please. I guess there is a microphone over there. Just hold a minute. Short questions, please, for the panel.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Sardica. Thank you for the panel. My question is regarding Latin America and the problem of governance. Does the problem of governance in Latin America affect the proximity of the continent to democracies in Europe? And if so, shouldn't European democracies or the EU turn to Latin America and try to diminish China's influence in Southern American market and therefore reassure its position to Russia, given the fact that there's a spirit of alliance between these two countries? Thank you.
It is addressed to our expert in Latin America,
Yes,
Professor
please.
Carlos Malamud.
Yes, please.
Professor Malamud, Lisbon is calling.
Well,
Thank you very much.
In fact, Latin American reality is crossed by heterogeneity and fragmentation. This does make it impossible to have a single answer to a complex question like that. We have many countries that have elections in this year and in the next years. The period from 2021 and 2025, all Latin American countries except Cuba, for obvious reasons, and Bolivia because it voted at the end of 2020, have presidential elections, and also we have local elections, regional elections, referendums such in Chile next year to approve the new constitution that is now in debate in the Constitutional Assembly. So the situation is very volatile. People, societies are angry with the way that governments manage the situation and the fight against the pandemic, but isn't a new situation. In the years previous to the pandemic, the so-called anger vote or voto bronca is there and punish all the governments. That happens in Ecuador. And we will have this year and next year crucial elections in the region. We have presidential elections this year in Chile. We have a presidential election next year in Colombia and in Brazil. And everything could happen in those countries. We don't know what will be the winner. Could be the left candidate, the right candidate, or the center candidate. All is possible, and the polls aren't conclusive about what will happen in the region in the next elections.
Thank you very much, Professor Malamud. And to keep in time, I am sorry we have no further minutes for questions from the public, but I guess debate can go on outside in the gardens or in the spare moments of this very rich course. I will give the floor now for the closure to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Spain in Lisbon, Marta Betanzos-Roig, for the closure of this session. Madam Ambassador represents the country that we are also honoring here in our memorial debate, Adolfo Suarez, the President of the Government of Spain and one of the key architects of La Transición, as the Spanish call it. So, Madam Ambassador, for the farewell in our session, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the listeners, but also thank you very much to all the speakers, Professor José Miguel Sardica, Ángel Rivero, and also good friends also being there on the other side of the border in Madrid, Charles Powell, Carlos Malamud, and García Lasqueti. I would like just to, for a couple of comments, a couple of notes as a closure. For Spain and Portugal, it was a great game changer, the entry in the EU structure. Our two countries did change dramatically, both internally speaking and also externally speaking. That was something hype. But it was, that was a moment that did change our minds, our expectations, our future, and indeed our present. I believe that, unfortunately, that will not be the case with Latin America, because they have not had the opportunity to get funds and also to be politically integrated into bigger structures, multilateral structures. That is not the case in Spain and Portugal. I would like to put a optimistic note, since we have benefited from very important funds. In those days, our administrations, our political actors, our social networks maybe were not as European as they are right now. And therefore, I believe that we have to prove our population, we have to prove our EU member states, and also our country friends in Latin America, that we are able to digest these big funds, we're able to transform our economies, our social nets, and also our institutions in order to give a push also to our Latin American friends. I know that is a great challenge. We have a great challenge ahead of us. And if we have been able to overcome at least the worst effects of the pandemic, maybe in cooperating and in playing together and in becoming more Iberian and more coordinated and more ambitious as two neighbor countries, we may also be able to give a good perspective, not only for our countries, also in our framework of the as European members, and also as Ibero-American or Latin American friends. And that's it. Thank you very much.